Okay, so it is 3:01, so we will get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on policing. During the webinar today, we are going to talk through some of the current challenges that police are currently facing and some issues related to police reform. We will also discuss the role of the police officer and the importance of communication between law enforcement and citizens. In addition, we're going to discuss policing specific to the Black Lives Matter movement. My name is Jennifer Biddle, and I am the program lead for the Doctor of Criminal Justice program in the School of Business. I'll be the moderator for this webinar. We also have with us Drs. Gabrielle Subak and Mike Simmons and doctoral candidate Joe Hebert. Unfortunately, Dr. Dan Augusto will not be able to join us today. He lives in the Houston area and is currently evacuating today with his family, so he is in our thoughts and prayers for safety at this time. For us, this is the perfect setting to have this type of discussion. It's important to have this type of dialogue, especially in an academic setting, in order to facilitate change. As academics and practitioners, it's imperative that we are moving the needle to implement sustained social and organizational change. And it's conversations such as this that form that narrative. We recognize that conversations about policing can be divisive and emotionally charged, especially during this time. We have been incredibly thoughtful about the information and the speakers that we have brought together for this discussion. We want to acknowledge that there may be differing views amongst speakers and participants, and we ask that everyone remember to be respectful and extend grace while communicating about this extremely important topic. We'll begin by having each of the participants introduce themselves. After the introduction, I'll ask a series of questions to our participants for discussion. Although our Dr. Augusto is unable to join us in person today, he has provided some comments. So I'll read some of the information that he has provided after we go through the questions. Then we will open up the questions to the audience. Please make sure to use the Q&A to post any questions that you may have. So with that, Dr. Subak, would you like to introduce yourself? Dr. Subak, are you able to introduce yourself? We can't hear you.
I think we might be having some technical difficulties there. I see you unmuted, and now you're muted, but we can always come back if we need to.
Sure. Dr. Simmons, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Dr. Mike Simmons. I'm a 2019 graduate of NCU. I earned my doctorate in business administration with focus on public administration. I was in law enforcement for 8 years as a patrol officer and supervisor, taught criminal justice courses at a local community college for 3 years. Prior to that, I was in the United States Marine Corps for 5 years. I did do my doctoral dissertation on officers who were exposed to the Black Lives Matter movement in the Ferguson riots of 2014.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Hebert, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Joseph Hebert. I'm a doctoral student at Central University. I've been involved in law enforcement for 40 plus years. Started in the military, graduated and went to law enforcement in the state of California, and have been working in the state of Louisiana now for 30 plus years in law enforcement. I've probably done every assignment there is within law enforcement. And presently I'm the commander of patrol and special events in Eastern New Orleans. So I'm glad to be here and hope we can all learn something from each other.
Great, thank you. Dr. Subak.
I'm sorry, yeah, I'm back. Somehow I had lost audio and had to re-sign in again. I'm a adjunct faculty member with North Central University since 2004. I'm teaching criminal justice and homeland security courses. I'm also an NCU graduate. I have over 30 years law enforcement experience. For off 3 years, I used to work for the Bavarian State Police in Germany. And I worked for almost 30 years for Lee County and Henry County Sheriff's Office in Florida. I'm like our lieutenant. I worked in all different areas of law enforcement. I started off in the jail, worked in corrections. I worked in intelligence and crime analysis. And then I went into forensic science. So most of my career, I was a crime scene specialist and crime scene investigator. I'm also a certified bloodstain pattern analyst. And I'm a certified Florida Auxiliary Certified Correction and Law Enforcement Officer. So I also have a little bit of everything.
Wonderful, great. Thank you so much for those introductions.
And I'm looking forward to this.
Sorry, I cut you off.
No problem. I was just saying I'm happy to be on this panel.
Thank you. And I'm very excited for the information that's going to be shared here today. So the first couple questions that I have revolve around training. So the first question is in terms of what type of training do you receive during a typical police academy? And to that vein, after that, what type of ongoing training is required as a police officer?
Well, if I can start, I can tell you in the state of Louisiana, the Peace Officer Standards of Training requires 496 hours of training for a basic academy certificate. In the city of New Orleans, because of the federal consent decree, they now offer each recruit 1,012 hours of training to graduate. After graduation, and once they complete their field assignments with a training officer, the state requires 20 hours of training, which also includes 8 hours of firearms training. So that's an additional 12 hours of various other subjects. The city offers 40 hours of training to include de-escalation and handling the mentally ill that has just been added because of the consent decree. So in Louisiana, that's what's established now. In California, when I went to the basic academy in California, we were well over 1,200 hours before we were able to go into field training. So I know each state is different, and that's the two states that I have experience with.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting that you point that out, that there's such variation from department to department and state to state in terms of what's required. Dr. Simmons or Dr. Subak, would you like to kind of weigh in here?
I was an officer, and go ahead, Dr. Subak.
We also have the training standards. They're set by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for Florida. And once the officer he has to take a state test after the academy. Once he passes that state test, he is certifiable, but he will be a certified officer once he's sworn in by an agency. And then in our agency, we had mandatory training, and it consisted of firearms training, of driving training, of defense tactics, and we also had juvenile justice, cultural diversity training, and in addition, we were offered verbal judo training.
I would say Missouri is very similar to what you guys have already mentioned. We also had 3 hours of mandatory racial profiling training every year, so that's 3 hours annually. We, at least my department, we did annual self-defense, annual taser training, semi-annual firearms training. Most agencies in Missouri have numerous trained crisis intervention team officers, specifically trained to deal with veterans in crisis, suicidal subjects, things like that. My particular department was a smaller department, and we had all 13 of our patrol officers trained in crisis intervention training.
Wow,
I have
that's great.
one addition I would like to add is like when I went for the academy and most of the training was classroom training, was not scenario-based training. But in the late years, in the last 2 or 3 years, you know, the use of force training was changed into actual hands-on training and into scenario-based training, where we had, for example, one of the trainings we did was we had an old trailer at the gun range, and it was a scenario of domestic violence, and then we had to respond to the domestic violence scene, you know, to see all the different scenarios and how to respond if somebody is going to use force against you. So I think that scenario-based training is much, much better than just watching PowerPoints and sitting in a classroom.
So in terms of kind of continuing that dialogue regarding, I know you mentioned the situational training for use of force. Are there other types of training that are used for the use of force? Kind of what's the requirements there in terms of the specific departments that you've worked for or what you're familiar with for your state?
There is I believe it's called a FATS trainer. It's basically a large video screen, a wall-size video screen that projects full-size videos, and the officer taking the training is presented different scenarios of a possible suspect with a gun or without a gun, a possible hostage situation where they're given a shoot, no shoot situation to determine whether or not they're going to engage, or if it's a use of force. There's also a similar training that involves an air cannon, so you actually have the sound of gunfire incorporated into the training. And there's actually several studies that show that that particular type of training does help officers reduce the likelihood of misidentifying a weapon and shooting in a non-shoot situation.
Yes, in Louisiana, we actually do the exact same training. It is mandatory that all officers complete that training. And it's training that will really open your eyes, especially with some of the scenarios that are played out that you may not have knowledge of or may not be familiar with. And it really puts each officer in a predicament where he has to not only think on his feet, but make those quick decisions that he's going to have to make in the street.
Are there a specific amount of hours that are required for use of force training, or is it just the particular training that's offered has to be taken?
In Louisiana, annually, it's 2 hours.
In Florida, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement has a standard of the required hours of retraining every 4 years. So you have to have all the certificates, and then you have to have the annual training for the high liabilities within the agency for every year. If you don't show that training, you're going to be decertified.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. So in terms of your experience, in what areas do you think that officers could benefit from additional training?
The example I just gave with the trainer, like I said, that you can't get enough training where you're put into a position where you have to make quick decisions. There's just no other training like it. You know, your annual firearms training where you're shooting at a paper target, that might help you with your aim or maybe reloading speed, but it doesn't ever put you in that position where you have to determine, does this person present a threat? Should I transition to maybe less use of force? That type of training is invaluable, and it should be done as often as possible.
Yes, I think around the country right now, there's a big movement on for anti-bias training and human relations training because of what we're seeing happening around the country. I first saw that type of training with the military police when I was in the Marine Corps back in the late 1970s that continued into the 80s when I went to municipal policing. And again, we're starting to see that again. One of the problems as far as training is concerned, and I'm sure this is probably true for a lot of departments, you run short of personnel and training gets pushed back or put on a back burner, or people are out sick or maybe out on vacation, and they may lapse in some of the training, with the exceptions of that mandatory training that every officer knows that he has to have or he would be decertified, such as firearms, defensive tactics, and things of that nature. But getting along with people and being able to communicate with people are probably my two top training topics.
I remember when I went to the academy in 1996, 1997, that we also had a section which was cultural diversity, and we actually had a test on that. And if you don't pass that test for the cultural diversity, you would not move on in the academy.
Okay, we did have a question on the chat, so let me just see.
Would you like for me to read it out, Jennifer?
Sure.
Dr. Biddle? Okay. I understand the training for racial profiling, but seriously, 3 hours annually? I also heard someone say they received training on how to deal with forceful offenders. What about the offender who is not showing any type of force or threat? What is the protocol?
So to be blunt, racial profile training is 3 hours annually is quite a bit, actually. There's not, at least in Missouri, our training was basically going over the Missouri statutes involving racial profiling training. There's not a whole lot of ways to have a class about how not to racial profile. You're either racial profiling or you aren't. We give examples of what racial profiling is, and in my personal opinion at my department, I don't think that we really had racial profiling. But as far as dealing with nonviolent people, you're trained to always be one level above the person that you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with someone that is not hostile, then you should be speaking to them as you would speak with anyone, like anyone else, with your hands ready in the front and, basically in a cordial position. If they start to become hostile, then you become elevated one level higher than that. So maybe if they're hostile, then you would possibly have your taser out, or if they have a weapon, then one level above that. But you're always trying to be one level higher than the person that you're dealing with, because you don't want to be caught off guard. And when someone decides to attack you, you literally have a split second to react to that. And you don't want to be not ready for it.
Yes, very well explained.
Okay, great. Dr. Subak, did you want to say something, or I wasn't sure?
Just thinking when I listened to this, that's what we were trained on, to always be aware of your surroundings, because anything can go from good to bad within a second. And I think we have seen that. If we look at that Atlanta shooting, for the guy who was, I believe it was a Wendy's, who fell asleep at the drive-thru, and he was, the officers talked real nice to him. He was real friendly, talking back to him. There was no problem. It was a good conversation. But as soon as they told him and put the handcuffs on, he went crazy. So you never know. And like Dr. Simmons says, you always have to be prepared for the worst.
Thank you. So the next set of questions, we're going to move from training and talk a little bit about communication. So the first question, what obstacles do officers face policing during the Black Lives Matter movement?
So I interviewed 26 officers in the St. Louis area that were exposed to basically the initial protesting after the Michael Brown shooting, and then the several flare-ups that happened afterwards. The officers that I interviewed were exposed to a range of things, anything from water bottles being thrown at them, concrete blocks were thrown at them. One officer I interviewed was actually shot in the shoulder. Obviously, insults. I interviewed several Black officers. It's interesting to note that of all 26 subjects that I interviewed, everyone unanimously said that the Black officers were treated worse than the white officers. Racial epithets were thrown at them. One officer was working the line and his wife called, panicked because there was Black Lives Matter protesters in her yard throwing stuff at the house while he was on duty. One department had their entire network hacked by Anonymous, and all of their bank accounts were hacked, and they had to start taking paper checks because their identities were all stolen. And most of the officers had vehicles purchased in their names, bank accounts opened in their names, a lot more than you would ever hear on the news.
Great, thank you so much. Mr. Hebert or Dr. Subak, did you want to add anything?
Well, we haven't seen any of those instances within Louisiana as of yet. Well, I should say that in the New Orleans area. However, there was a officer involved shooting in Lafayette, Louisiana on Saturday, which did lead to some protests and some riots and situations. That's still probably under investigation. There's only a little video footage that's available for the public to see. But I think the public, when these things occur, jump to conclusions before all of the evidence is in. And with most of officers wearing body-worn cameras and outside video footage, if you wait to see the footage, you can make a better determination of what maybe was wrong and what was right. Just not go on what you see that's first 15 minutes of what the media wants to show you.
Thank you. So the next question is, how can we increase the discourse and communication between police and the community?
And one of the ways I've always thought that could be done would be through community meetings. I would probably tell you in the last year in all of the community meetings that I have been fortunate enough to attend, they all got out of hand within 10 minutes. So the meeting would either be disbanded or would not be able to continue from the police point of view because of the disruptions by the citizens. So I had to quickly rule that out. The only thing that I see that my department does and several of the other departments in the area is provide ride-alongs to citizens that are interested. And we also have our doors open. Citizens can come into the office and see the office area that we work in and speak to officers and things of that nature, so that we try and remain transparent and open and have some type of dialogue with the citizens that we serve.
We have something similar in Florida. It's called the Citizens Academy. where we invite the citizens to, like, I believe it's a 12 weeks program, one evening a week for 3 hours. And we show them, you know, what police does. They will spend a couple hours with dispatch. They can listen into the 911 calls. They can do a ride along if they like to, or I have done the forensics part. So I set up a mock crime scene and show them all the tools of the trade we have and walk them through a investigation on what we do, show them the crime lab. And then the homicide unit will, you know, show them all the cases they work and how they investigate. So it is kind of trying to bring transparency of police work into the community. And we have done this for years, and it is pretty successful. And we always have a lot of people who are applying for it and want to attend it.
As kind of a follow-up question to this, do you think that there is a need for additional communication, that, you know, maybe there's different things that haven't been explored of kind of how to increase the level of communication?
So I think the programs that were just described are great. However, you know, you might spend a year of doing those programs and only get to 50 people, and one tweet can reach millions of people in a split second. I think social media is something that the police departments need to explore a little better, and get out in front of these scenarios. For example, what we just had a few days ago, where there was another shooting of an unarmed Black citizen. I listened to the radio that day driving around, and I pulled over and actually wrote down the exact words in the news report, and it said that an unarmed Black citizen was shot by a police officer while he was getting into his vehicle. Now, that on its face sounds horrible, and how could something like that happen? And then I got home, turned on my computer, and I actually watched the video, and what I saw in the video was an unarmed Black citizen dealing with police. The police were yelling at him, giving him orders. He was ignoring the orders of the police, went around the front of the vehicle, continuing to ignore the orders of the police, who now had him at gunpoint. He opened his door and began reaching inside from what I could see underneath his seat. So that's a complete different story than what you heard on the radio. And from the time I was driving around till the time I got home was about a half an hour, and I heard that story repeated 3 times every 10 minutes. So we, as police officers, we have to get out in front of these stories, because social media is doing it instantly, and you may only get a split second of a video or a partial video that doesn't show the entire story. And by the time the police make a formal statement, it could be 8 hours later, and this story has been spread around millions and millions of times, and you're lost at that point. You can't catch up to it. And then you've already got people out in the street rioting. So I think law enforcement agencies need to be better on the social media aspect.
Thank you very much.
I agree with that, definitely.
Thank you. So my next question kind of ties to a question that we have in the chat. So the question is, why do you think that the communication between some segments of the population and the police are strained? And the specific question in the Q&A is, how about dealing with mental illness? What type and how training is given to officers to assist? So basically, the question revolves around, for, you know, specific populations, maybe those with disabilities, is there additional training, or those with mental illness, is there additional training that is required? And do you think there's kind of, you know, I guess an element of how police officers relate to the different segments of the population?
Well, in New Orleans, we have crisis intervention training for officers that are assigned to those particular duties. That is 40 hours of training where they actually work with mentally ill patients under supervision. Prior to this movement, I would say within the last 5 years, it was just what it was. You faced with that crisis and you de-escalated it and you handled it. Now it's more formal training. Like I said, each officer gets 40 hours of training. Unfortunately, not every officer can attend that training, but we do have enough officers that are trained to be able to come in and take over a situation at a moment's notice. Dealing with the mentally ill has been a problem for officers in Louisiana, because 4 years ago, the governor then closed down the majority of the mental hospitals, especially the walk-in clinics. So you had a lot of mentally ill patients that were walking around or existing that had no medication for months at a time, and created a problem for the police. And we do see a substantial amount of mentally ill people that we do have to make contact with, unfortunately. The good thing about that is, although the police has to make contact with them, it's not because of any criminal nature.
I completely agree with that. As an officer in my local department, we had no resources. It was a fairly small town of about 13,000, and we did have a hospital, and the police got called every single time there was a mental related issue. We respond, and we are not psychologists, we're not psychiatrists, we're police officers, and we're stuck in these positions dealing with people that are having mental breakdowns or suicidal, and we just don't have the resources, particularly at 2 or 3 in the morning when nothing's open. And our only resource was the hospital. And even the emergency rooms are not equipped to deal with psychological issues. In many cases, we would drop them off at the hospital. Of course, we would have to stay on site because the hospital didn't necessarily have security. And the doctor's hands are kind of tied. They can sedate the person and wait until the morning. But in Missouri, there's not a lot of empty beds available for psychological patients. So it's a tough situation for police to be in. We do have training on how to de-escalate with psychological issues. But keep in mind, just because it's a psychological issue doesn't mean that it can't turn violent. In fact, many psychological issues do turn violent. People don't want to go to the hospital. People don't want to be taken away from their families for 96 hours on a court order for mental evaluation. So things on a flip of a switch can turn violent very quickly. And a lot of them are psychologically or drug related.
Thank you.
We had the same issue in Florida. We used to have 2 mental health facilities, and they're both being closed in the end of the 90s. So unfortunately, we would Baker Act them or Marchman Act them and put them into the facility versus into the jail. But now our jails are kind of the revolving doors for the mental health people. They come in there, they get their psychological help while they're in the jail. When they get released, they get a bag of medication, and when that medication runs out, they're kind of on the streets. They don't have a job. Most of them don't have a family or a place to go. So they're going to fall back to drugs, to alcohol. They're going to start thefts, and then back they go to the jail. So it's that vicious circle that has been created.
Thank you. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. So what happens when officers turn off their body cam? And in talking about the Georgia shooting, is it true that a taser is not considered a lethal weapon?
In Florida, a taser is non-lethal because we have the matrix, and it is not considered a lethal weapon. A lethal weapon is only the firearm.
Yeah, same in Louisiana. Taser is non-lethal. Unfortunately, not every department officer carries a taser.
Great, thank you. Okay, and there's another one. I've been hearing more about including social workers as part of a team effort. As Dr. Simmons attests, most of you aren't mental health practitioners. Do you feel it would be useful to include more mental health workers as part of the police response?
I think, I mean, yes, the more people that you can get to help you, the better. I think, you know, we do have resources. A lot of the times we do get people to social workers. The problem is you can't have a social worker in your patrol car all the time. It's just there's not enough social workers out there to do that. It would be nice if there was an on-call social worker that in a situation where you might need one at 2 in the morning. But even in that case, they're not going to instantly be there, and you might be on a scene for an hour and a half before they show up. So yes, it would be great to have those resources available. I just don't think that the public is going to fund something like that.
Yes, when I was assigned to the child abuse unit, we worked as a team with a social worker, and that was great. But the social worker caused more problems than the victims and the parents of the victims for the officers to handle. So I would be all in favor of having a social worker, but again, as a follow-up person, and just like Dr. Simmons said, it's an hour, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours or more before that social worker is available to respond to the scene. In the meantime, you have an officer that's not in the field that could be out handling other calls. We have to find a medium someplace, but I don't think that that's going to work out. Most social workers are not going to want to, number one, be in a marked police unit, and number two, be out in the field unarmed. Again, you know, when I was in a child abuse unit, we ran into several confrontations where the social worker got injured because she was unable to defend herself against what the police officers wound up having to provide resistance for. So yes and no, and I agree that we need to find some medium to answer that question, but putting a social worker in the field is not really the answer at this particular point.
Thank you. So the next question is, how can the public have a better understanding of what police officers do?
I think I would have to go back to what Dr. Simmons said earlier. Having the police departments become more proactive with using social media. One of the things that everybody can know is that the only thing that you see on the nightly news is negativity from the police department. And actually the police department needs to start putting out those positive things and make sure that there's coverage of the positive things that happen. Every day we go to policeone.com because that is part of our training regimen on a daily basis for roll call. And you can see those things there that officers have done around the country that's just so magnificent for the communities that they serve. Yet that's not what you see on the news. That's not what gets reported. We do have a pretty progressive newspaper here in New Orleans, and they do publish a lot of those significant things that police officers have accomplished. But it's just the continued negativity that I think provides citizens with that connotation that officers are not really serving their community.
I think it's also important, police departments in general need to get out the message as to why officers are doing what they're doing. If you go to any Facebook feed or, you know, you watch a YouTube video of an officer involved shooting, just scroll down into the comment section and you're instantly going to find, you know, thousands of negative things about police. You know, why are there 2 people pulling me over? Well, there's a reason why there's 2 police officers pulling you over. One initiated the traffic stop and the other one's there as backup. And there's a reason why they do that is because for the last 30 years that we've had dash cameras, we have training where we have to sit and watch police officers get shot in the face on a traffic stop because they didn't have backup. Police officers getting assaulted. So at that point, when you're watching these videos as part of your training, you're calling for backup so that you're not out there by yourself. Why is there, so many officers on a psychological patient? Well, if you have to take that person to the hospital, they're probably not going to want to go. So it's not like you can just say, hey, hop in the back of my car, we're going to take you to the hospital, because they've probably been to the hospital before. They've probably know that if you go to the hospital, you're going to get a 96, which means a doctor is going to sign a form saying you're basically in a hospital for 96 hours. People don't necessarily want help, even though they need help, and you need to have more than one officer on a scene to get them the help that they need. A lot of people just think that, police officers are power hungry and, we don't have anything better to do that night, so we're going to have 3 officers pull someone over. That's not why there's 3 officers out there. There's 3 officers out there so that 3 officers can go home at the end of their shift.
Thank you. So the next set of questions look more at the structure of the system itself. So in terms of how do you think that departments can do a better job of identifying problem officers and weeding them out of the system, or even prevent their hiring?
One of the things I did for my study, I had all the officers take what's called the Symbolic racism scale. It was a survey. It only had maybe 14 questions, and it was very easy to take, but it was designed to determine the level of racism in the person who was taking the survey. I think most departments have a psychological exam that you take, and that can be 300 or 400 questions. But I think we need to try not to react as much and try more to prevent problem officers from becoming officers to begin with. Possibly adding some different level of questions regarding racism or biases in like a polygraph exam for hiring, things like that. If we don't have the problem officers to begin with, it's a lot easier than trying to get a problem officer out of the department, especially if you work for a department that has a union. It's almost impossible to get an officer fired.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. And what my experience is from internal affairs, we use technology to track officers that seem to be having problems in the field and provided them with retraining and things of that nature. However, as everyone I'm sure is well aware, New Orleans have had their share of bad apples. Thus, the federal consent decree being part of that. But they are systems that are available to provide that technology to departments. One is the early warning system. There's another system called IA-PRO, and there's another system called the early intervention system. And that are all psychological type studies that can help the departments, as the cliche goes, weed out those officers that shouldn't be there.
That's a good point. I can see one other option, like if an officer has internal affairs and he knows that he's going to get fired over what he did, and then many agencies give them the option to resign. So it will not go into their records, so they can go to any other agency and can go there. So maybe there should be more communication between the agencies when an officer leaves one agency and goes to another, to find out, how he was at the agency, to find out if he resigned and how many IAs and how many problems, how much of a problem child he actually was, instead of giving him a fresh start right away. So they would know that there were some issues with the previous agency and maybe take a closer look at him, or, monitor him closer in his first couple months of duty.
I think
that
that's
this
a great
is
idea.
a
And I don't think
really,
it's that hard to implement something like that. At least in Missouri, we have a Missouri Post department, and they're specifically designed for your annual certifications and your post certifications. I don't see why there couldn't be a database that, you know, has a list of problem officers, so that when you're a chief getting ready to hire someone, you can make that part of your background check.
Yes. One of the things in the late 1990s, we had FBI agents that were assigned to work with internal affairs. And one of the things that they created was an internal system that tracked violent complaints against officers. In the early 2000s, there was talk about a federal database being created. But as Dr. Simmons stated, the police unions got wind of that, and that really got knocked out. However, recently that was resurrected, and in New York now, all internal affairs complaints are public information. So citizens can see and track the number of complaints on any particular officer in the state of New York.
so in terms of there being a complaint, so there's that initial complaint and then there's an investigation. Is the information that provided kind of the outcome of whether, I guess, you know, in simplistic terms, if there was fault by the officer or if there was nothing founded? Is that typically how it works?
Yes and no. You take in a complaint from a citizen and an investigation is launched, whether it be by a supervisor within one of the departments or even by internal affairs itself. And then there's several dispositions of that complaint that could happen. One, it could be unfounded, that through investigation, it was proven that the incident never did occur. Second, it could be not sustained because there's not enough evidence to prove or disprove that the incident took place. And it could be sustained because the investigation showed beyond a shadow of a doubt that the incident did take place and that the officer's action was deemed to be in violation of policy or procedure.
And then what typically would happen at that point? Is there suspension?
If it was a founded complaint, then it would go to a bureau chief and then up to the superintendent to decide exactly what punishment the officer would receive. In our book, we probably have about 40 pages of progressive discipline depending upon what section of the policy or procedure you violated, and determine how many times you may have violated that policy is going to depend upon what punishment you could receive, to include dismissal.
Great, thank you. So do you all feel as if there is an opportunity at this point to reassess the current structure of the way we police now? Is there opportunities within the overall structure, the bureaucracy of policing?
I'm kind of torn. I think we are in a position in history where we need police more than ever. The violence in inner cities and the weapons that are available to criminals it's horrendous what police officers are having to deal with right now. If anything, I would say we need to revert back to an older style of policing, you know, the broken windows theory, hitting the levels of high crime, and, you know, just really cranking down on those areas.
So
I
just
think
for our listeners that aren't familiar with broken windows theory, could you
so.
explain a little what the philosophy is?
Broken windows theory is basically referring to what people might call the bad neighborhoods, where the buildings are run down, the windows are broken, people don't really care about that area anymore, and that's where you see areas of high crime. The way to, well, historically, particularly in New York, where the broken windows theory was applied, they ramped up the level of policing in those areas. Not just throwing a bunch of police officers at the situation, but putting more officers on scene where people are seeing officers on a daily basis. They know they're not necessarily going to get away with the crime there. And then once the crime level starts to go down, then you need to come in and you need to fix the broken windows. You need to get the community involved in this, because once the community is involved in fixing the broken windows, making the buildings nice again, putting people in apartments in that area, once there's people there that care about the area, the crime's going to stay down, because they're going to be more willing to report the crime because they don't want their neighborhoods trashed. So it's not just throwing a bunch of police at a situation. It's throwing a bunch of police at the situation and then getting the community involved once it's safe again, and getting them to participate and, build their communities back.
Dr. Subak or Mr. Hebert, did you have anything to add to that?
I think that was very well spoken. It's been New York initiated that program, and it was very successful in New York. We have used it in New Orleans from time to time. We've even had the creators of that theory come to New Orleans and help New Orleans apply those theories to the areas that we had with crime. And it did help. But I think the whole thing comes down to citizen participation. It depends on the citizens. And right now, with the drug trade that we have and the amount of violence that we're seeing on the streets, the citizens are just really afraid. It's almost like we need to put more police in areas where there is violence to clean that violence out of that area. Unfortunately, when you move it from one area to another area, you just might be creating another monster. So you have to use what I call a blanket approach. You have to wrap it around the entire area where there's violence being perpetrated against the citizens, to get the citizens to have a better feeling about the area that they live. Report those characters that don't live in the area but frequent the area to continue their business. Those are the things that really help. It really all comes back to the citizen.
Great, thank you. So those are all the questions that I had scripted for today. Is there any additional questions from the participants or any comments?
I will also share this recording in the Commons. I'll actually do a Commons announcement so that anyone who was unable to attend can also ask some questions in there. I think there's been some really great discussion today, and I'm sure there's people who weren't able to attend that would like to join the conversation.
Yes.
Do the panelists have any closing remarks they'd like to share?
Well, I think I'd just like to share, we talked about a lot of different things as far as the police is concerned. The biggest thing that we see that's really driving home this propensity of violence in our neighborhoods is drugs. And drugs is just literally everywhere now. And that's got to be the first area where we actually start, if you want to use the phrase, take back our streets. That has to be the first area. We've got to keep our children safe. We've got to keep our schools open, but we've got to keep the drugs out of there as well.
I agree. Drugs are definitely a major problem and a source of a lot of the crime. I think a lot of the source of the anger between citizens and police is political. I've never seen an environment that's so divided politically right now as we are in our nation. And, you know, stemming back even to 2014, I think the word racism gets thrown around a lot. I don't, in over 13 years of policing, I can honestly say I've never ran across an officer that I outwardly identified as someone who was racist. I never really saw any of my officers showing any kind of racism towards subjects. And, you know, even there's a study from 2008 where they studied East St. Louis Police Department. And I think there are something like 98% Black officers in that department. And the public didn't even trust that department. The study showed that the public was not trustworthy of the department. The fact that they had pretty much an identical demographic with the police department as the citizens, being a large Black community, that didn't even help the department. I think it's more of a mindset of certain groups that just are afraid of the police. They've been raised to be afraid of the police. Certain types of music kind of promote violence against police or distrust of police. I think it's more than just the police need to fix it. It needs to be fixed socially, and I wish I had a magic wand that could fix it, but I don't think any amount of change in a police department is going to fix it. It needs to be fixed both on both sides of the protest side, if you will.
Yes.
So we have a comment and question in the chat. I noticed myself reacting to a comment that you made, Dr. Simmons. I'm not sure I have your wording recorded right, but you said something about there not being racial profiling. I'm curious if you have read the new Jim Crow, Kendi's anti-racist book, or Just Mercy. I feel I've learned so much about racial disparities. I know this is a lot to drop in the last few minutes.
So I will admit my department was in rural Missouri, so we didn't have a large Black community. As far as racial, no, and to answer your question, no, I haven't read those books. I will look into that. I'm all about reading different types of literature. As far as racial profiling goes, I think the most of racial profiling that would occur would be on a traffic stop, because that's typically when officers make a contact with a citizen that's not related to a call. Personally speaking, when I drove around looking to make a traffic stop, I was looking at license plates and not drivers. The easiest way to get a traffic stop is to find a headlight out or to find a tag that's expired, a license plate that's expired. So I can honestly say myself, I wasn't driving around looking for a different race or gender to pull over. I was looking at an expired license plate. I know a lot of officers do that. Again, I came from a smaller department, and that's why I can safely say I didn't see racial profiling, but there's, you know, departments with 35,000 officers, so I'm sure it does happen. But again, I didn't personally see that.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our participants and everybody who attended. We are at the top of the hour, and I'm hoping that maybe I can post Dr. Augusto's, because we didn't get a chance to kind of go through his comments, that I can post it, you know, to that web where you were putting it, Claire. So thank you all for participating. I really appreciate it. And I hope that we can continue these types of dialogues and discussions, as I said, to kind of, you know, continue to move that needle. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.